The phone had been dead for 10 years. Not dead like a battery, dead like everything else that had stopped when Daniel did. Margaret found it in a shoebox at the back of a closet she'd promised herself every year for a decade that she would finally clear out. She almost didn't plug it in. She told herself later that some small, stubborn part of her hoped it wouldn't turn on at all, that some things are supposed to stay buried. But it did turn on. The screen flickered, dimmed, then filled with a photo of the two of them on a beach they'd visited only once, both laughing at something neither of them could remember anymore. And sitting in the drafts folder, dated the night he died, was a message, never sent, waiting 10 years for her to find it. This is the story of what it said, and what it took from her to finally read it. Daniel and Margaret had been married for 22 years when he died, which meant that by the time it happened, their love had long since stopped announcing itself. It didn't need to. It lived in the smaller things, the way he always started the coffee before she woke up, the way she saved him the last piece of anything without either of them mentioning it, the particular rhythm of two people who had learned each other so completely that most of their communication no longer required words at all. He was 51. Healthy by every appearance that mattered. He golfed on Saturdays, complained about his knees, the way men his age are contractually obligated to, and had a laugh that Margaret still, 10 years later, sometimes thought she heard in crowded rooms before remembering it was gone. The night he died was, by every account she could reconstruct afterward, entirely unremarkable. They'd eaten dinner. He'd mentioned feeling tired, more tired than usual, but Daniel was a man who described most physical complaints as nothing, a word he used so often and so dismissively that Margaret had long since stopped taking it as information. He went to bed before her, which wasn't unusual. She came in an hour later, and he seemed to be sleeping soundly. She remembered with a clarity that had never dulled, despite the decade between her and that night, the small, ordinary decision she made to not wake him, to let him rest, because he'd said he was tired and because there seemed to be no reason not to. In the morning, he was gone. Not gone as in missing, gone as in still there, in the bed beside her, but no longer present in any way that mattered. The coroner would later explain it in clinical terms: a cardiac event in his sleep, likely quick, likely painless, the kind of ending that doctors describe as merciful when there is nothing else comforting left to say to the person left behind. Margaret would spend the next decade turning over every detail of that ordinary night, searching for a sign she had missed, a moment where a different decision might have changed the outcome. She would learn, slowly and at great cost, that grief does not respond well to hindsight. It only ever offers you the same unanswerable question, over and over, dressed in slightly different clothing each time. What if I had known? She did not know, that morning, that the answer to that question had been sitting in his phone the entire time. Powered off, forgotten, waiting. Grief, Margaret would later say to the handful of people close enough to hear her say anything true about it, is not a single event you recover from. It is a second marriage you didn't agree to, one that moves into the house with you and never quite leaves, even after you've learned to set a table for one and answer the phone without expecting anyone in particular on the other end. The first year was the kind of blur that people who haven't lived through it assume must feel dramatic, but it didn't. It felt administrative. There were forms to file, accounts to close, a wardrobe to eventually, agonizingly, decide what to do with. Grief in its early stages, she learned, often disguises itself as paperwork, because paperwork has deadlines, and deadlines are easier to survive than feelings are. By the second year, the casseroles from well-meaning neighbors had stopped arriving, and the world resumed its schedule around her in a way that felt, at the time, like a small betrayal, as if everyone else had simply agreed to move forward while she remained standing in the doorway of a house that no longer had the right number of people in it. She kept his side of the closet untouched for 4 years, not out of denial. She was clear-eyed enough to know exactly what she was doing and why, but because there is a particular kind of comfort in a coat that still smells faintly like someone, hanging exactly where they left it. She went back to work at the library where she'd been employed for most of her adult life, because routine, she discovered, was one of the only medicines that actually worked. She found she could get through an entire day cataloging returns and helping children find books about dinosaurs without once thinking about the empty side of the bed. And then she would drive home, turn the key, and remember all over again in the specific silence of a house built for 2 people that now held only her footsteps. Their daughter, Ellie, had been 20 when Daniel died, in her 2nd year of university, and Margaret had watched her daughter grieve in the particular way young adults grieve, fiercely, then privately, then eventually folding it into herself in a way that worried Margaret more than the fierce crying ever had. Mother and daughter had leaned on each other in the specific, wordless way people do when they're both trying to be strong for the other person's benefit and failing at exactly the same moments. By year 6, Margaret had built something that resembled a life again. Not the life she'd planned, not the one she would have chosen, but a life nonetheless, complete with its own rhythms and small pleasures and moments of unexpected laughter that no longer immediately curdled into guilt for having laughed at all. She had, by year 8, stopped visiting the cemetery every week and settled instead into a monthly visit that felt less like obligation and more like conversation. She found she could tell Daniel about her days in a way that felt, if not exactly like talking to him, then at least like talking toward him, into whatever remained of the space where he used to be. What she had not done in 10 years was open the box of his old belongings that Ellie had packed up in the disoriented first month after his death. Things pulled from drawers and nightstands too quickly to be properly sorted, shoved into a shoebox and pushed to the back of a closet, with the unspoken agreement between mother and daughter that it would be dealt with someday, when someday didn't feel quite so impossible. Someday arrived, uninvited, on an ordinary Tuesday, 10 years later, when Margaret finally decided to clear out the closet before repainting the room. The shoebox was lighter than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply stronger than she'd been the last time she'd tried to lift it and set it back down unopened. Inside were the small, unremarkable artifacts of a life interrupted mid-sentence, a watch that had stopped the same week he had, a wallet with an expired license and a folded photo of Ellie as a child, a set of keys to a car that had long since been sold. And underneath all of it, still in the drawer organizer tray Daniel had used on his nightstand for as long as she'd known him, was his phone. She sat on the floor of the closet for a long moment simply holding it, the way you might hold something that used to be alive. She half expected it to feel different somehow, heavier with the weight of 10 years, or lighter for having been emptied of use. It felt, in the end, like exactly what it was, a small, ordinary object that had once belonged to someone she loved. She found the charger in the same box, still coiled the way he always coiled it, a small habit she'd forgotten she'd loved about him, until the memory of it arrived, uninvited and sharp, in that moment on the closet floor. It took nearly a full minute plugged into the wall before the screen responded at all. A small white apple appearing, then fading, then appearing again, the phone seemingly deciding after a decade of silence whether it wanted to come back to life. When it finally did, the first thing she saw was the lock screen, a photo from a trip they'd taken to the coast years before he died, the 2 of them laughing at something the photo itself couldn't explain, caught in an ordinary moment neither of them had known would become this important later. She knew the passcode. Of course, she knew the passcode. It was Ellie's birthday, the same 4 digits he'd used for everything for 15 years. A small predictability that had once mildly annoyed her and now, in this moment, felt like the kindest thing he'd ever unknowingly left behind for her. The phone unlocked on the first try. She told herself she would only look for a few minutes. She stayed for 3 hours. The photos came first, hundreds of them, most unremarkable, all suddenly precious. A blurry picture of Ellie's high school graduation. A sunset he'd apparently found worth stopping the car for. A photo of Margaret herself, taken without her knowledge, laughing at something out of frame, her younger face caught in an expression she barely recognized as her own anymore. She moved to his messages next and found herself reading conversations with old friends, with his brother, with co-workers from a job he'd left years before he died. Ordinary exchanges about weekend plans and work deadlines and a running joke about a fantasy football league that had apparently consumed an alarming amount of his attention. She found their own conversation thread and read it slowly, message by message, watching 22 years of marriage condensed into the small, unremarkable texts that make up an actual life together. Pick up milk on your way home. Running 15 minutes late. Thinking about you today. Sent for no particular reason on an ordinary Wednesday. The kind of message she would have given anything in the years since to receive just one more time. It was nearly midnight, and she was preparing to set the phone down and return to it another day, when she noticed the small red notification badge on an app she almost hadn't opened. A folder within his messages labeled in his own handwriting adjacent typing style. Simply, drafts. There was only one message inside it. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m., the night he died. The message was addressed to her. It had never been sent. Margaret sat with her thumb hovering over it for what felt like an impossibly long time, aware in some instinctive way that whatever was inside it was going to change something about the decade she'd already lived through, was going to rewrite, in some fundamental way, the story she'd told herself about that ordinary night for 10 years. She opened it. Margaret, I don't want to scare you, so I'm not going to wake you up. But something feels wrong tonight. My chest has felt off since dinner, and I know I should probably say something, but you have that early shift tomorrow, and I don't want to send us both to an ER at midnight over what's probably nothing. If it is nothing, I'll delete this in the morning and we'll laugh about it. But if it's not, I need you to know that these 22 years have been the best thing that ever happened to me, and I wouldn't trade a single ordinary Tuesday with you for anything else this life had to offer. Tell Ellie I'm proud of her in case I don't get the chance to say it enough. Tell her I saw the person she was becoming, and I already knew she'd be extraordinary. And Margaret, if you're reading this because something happened, please don't spend the years after this wondering if there was something you could have done. There wasn't. I made the decision not to wake you. That was mine to make, and I made it because I loved you enough to let you sleep. I love you. I've loved you for 22 years, and I would have loved you for 40 more. Good night. The message ended there. Unsent. Saved to a draft at 11:47 p.m. on the last ordinary night of his life. Written, she understood now, in the final conscious hour Daniel Whitmore ever had, and never delivered because he must have fallen asleep before he could send it. Or perhaps because some part of him had genuinely believed, right up until the end, that he'd wake up in the morning and delete it entirely. Margaret sat on the closet floor and read it 7 times before she allowed herself to cry. Not the grief she'd carried for a decade, which had long since become familiar, almost gentle in its predictability, but something sharper and entirely new. The specific, devastating tenderness of understanding, 10 years too late, that the man she loved had spent his final conscious moments protecting her instead of saving himself. For 10 years, Margaret had privately carried aversion Of that night she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Ellie. A quiet, corrosive question about whether she should have noticed something, should have woken when he came to bed, should have somehow sensed what was happening beside her while she slept undisturbed through the last hours of her husband's life. The message did not erase the grief. Grief, she had learned by now, does not work that way. It does not resolve itself into something smaller simply because a new piece of information arrives. But it did something else, something she hadn't realized she'd still been waiting for after all these years. It removed the question. He had known. He had chosen deliberately and with the same quiet love that had defined their entire marriage, not to wake her. It had never been a night where she failed to notice something she should have caught. It had been a night where Daniel, with what little time and clarity he had left, made one final decision on her behalf, the same way he'd made 1,000 small decisions on her behalf over 22 years, always oriented toward her comfort, her rest, her well-being, even at the very end of his own. She called Ellie the next morning and read her the message over the phone, her voice breaking in the places Daniel's words landed hardest. The line about being proud of her, the line about already knowing she'd be extraordinary. Ellie, 30 years old now, cried the way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in years, finally receiving a decade late the goodbye her father had tried and failed to send her. Margaret did not delete the message. She transferred it carefully to 3 devices, printed a copy she kept folded in her wallet beside a photo of Daniel, and read it again on the anniversary of his death that year. Not out of sadness, though there was still plenty of that, but out of something closer to gratitude for a decade-old kindness that had finally found its way to her. Margaret still visits the cemetery once a month. She still talks to Daniel in the particular way she'd developed over the years, telling him about her days, about Ellie, about the ordinary small events that used to make up their shared life and now simply make up hers alone. But something in those visits changed after she found the message. She no longer went carrying an unspoken question. She went instead carrying something closer to peace, the specific hard-won peace of a woman who finally understood that the last thing her husband ever did was choose her comfort over his own survival, and that the silence of that final night had never been an accident or an oversight. It had been, in the truest sense, one final act of love. Some messages are read the moment they're sent. Others wait 10 years in the dark in an old phone at the back of a closet for the exact moment their recipient is finally ready to receive them. Daniel's goodnight, delayed by a decade, still managed to arrive exactly when Margaret needed it most.